Alcoholic beverages were an important part of everyday medieval life. Unlike modern times, drinking alcoholic beverages was a common, widespread activity. In fact, the earliest recorded European temperance society did not appear until 1818 AD in Sweden. It was established through the efforts of Lutheran clergy to limit consumption of the alcoholic beverage called schnapps. Nevertheless, these rules still allowed for the moderate consumption of wine and beer. So, with alcoholic beverages a critical part of social culture, what were the most popular drinks consumed by medieval people? Ale was the alcoholic drink of choice in medieval England and was consumed by all social classes. Due to questionable water sources for many at the time, ale was a preferred option for drinking, especially in large towns and cities. The fermentation process solved most potential water-related illness issues like cholera, contaminated wells, and microorganisms that could cause serious illness. Ale in particular was the common person's alcoholic beverage and was consumed by both men and women. Though medieval ale was much different than our modern machine-produced beverage, ale was made in small batches with no constant standard of production. Ale in medieval times was cloudy in appearance, often with remnants of the original ingredients contained in the beverage. Middle Ages ale was less bitter and sweeter than modern beer because there were no hops. Middle Ages ale was also much less carbonated with the absence of modern production methods. It often had a herbaceous or spice flavor with the introduction of ingredients like juniper, sage, and cinnamon by brewers after the Crusades period. Different brew houses offered their own flavors, depending on their location, brewing process, what ingredients were in season, and access to them. Malting barley or oats, which was the process of turning starches into sugar, would be performed by the brewer, who were mostly women. They were known as alewives and performed most of the brewing before the 14th century in England, even though anyone was allowed to brew ale. The strength of the ale was determined by how much water and grain was used to brew a batch. Without modern preservatives, medieval ale could not keep for long. Therefore, brewing was a constant process of creating new batches to satisfy demand. When fresh ale was ready, the alewife would hang an ale pool or ale stick, garlanded with foliage, outside or through a window, as a sign to the public it was available to consume. These households became known as alehouses. The use of ale pools went into decline as taverns and inns in the 14th century made pictorial signs for the mainly illiterate public to visit their establishments. Alehouses began following this trend around the 16th century. It is important to note the volume of ale served at these places was standardized. Clause 35 of the Magna Carta in 1215 stated there should be a single measure for ale throughout the kingdom. Additionally, many towns in England had ale conners, also known as ale tasters, that monitored the measure, quality, and pricing of ale served by a brewer, with producers in violation of their rules subject to fines. In addition, the public shaming from brewing a bad batch in a community where you depended on customers could have disastrous consequences. With an adult male consuming over 1 gallon per day of ale in 1300s England, it is important to state that the alcoholic content was not at today's higher levels. The small ale they consumed, also known as small beer, usually had an alcohol content of around 1% or less. Ale was a dietary staple in medieval times, with an estimated 80% of caloric intake in medieval England from bread and ale. Ale was also popular due to its perceived nutritional value and to satisfy thirst. Ale was such a part of daily life that peasants were often paid for their labor in part with quantities of ale. Now, we shall present another popular medieval alcoholic beverage. Cider was another preferred alcoholic drink in medieval England, with laborers' wages partially paid by cider in certain areas. During the Middle Ages, apples were grown in orchards across the land, though southwest counties like Somerset and the southeast region have long traditions with cider. It is interesting to note that apples in medieval times were smaller in size and less sweet compared to modern varieties. The medieval process for producing cider was harvesting the apple, juicing, straining, and fermenting the juice with wild yeast. Unlike modern mass-produced carbonated ciders, there was no uniform taste with each batch. Medieval cider had less sweetness compared with today's manufactured product and had a cloudy appearance due to the lack of modern filtration. In addition to small-scale farm producers, monasteries were also regular makers of ciders. They would sell the majority of their cider to the public. Wine was an elite choice of drink in medieval England, especially red wine. Nobility and upper classes imported wine from around the mid-12th century into England to impress their guests with its quality and their abundance. This wine would often be produced in France, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula. Unlike these countries, where wine was an accessible common drink, Northern Europe did not have favorable growing conditions. Wine was thought to have medicinal benefits in moderation. The quality of wine consumed was determined by the type of grape and number of pressings used in production. First and second pressings were preferred by the wealthy and most expensive. Third pressings were more affordable for commoners and of lesser quality. When obtained, peasants would often drink these vinegary contents mixed with water, which was considered better than the risk of drinking water alone. Medieval wine did not compare to modern vintages and was commonly referred to as having poor taste. It spoiled rather quickly due to air exposure, since at that time proper ways for resealing these contents were unavailable. Therefore, once a cask of wine was opened, people tried to consume its contents as soon as possible. Without the benefit of modern winemaking methods, and often using grapes which were not fully ripened, even the taste of quality medieval wine could not compare to modern standards. Once casks were opened, wine was often mixed with spices like cloves, nutmeg, and ginger to mask the harsh taste as contents soured from exposure. Mead was a medieval drink consumed by all classes, though not widely consumed like ale and wine. Also known as honey wine, it was a honey-based drink usually fermented with wild yeast and mixed with water. The taste of medieval mead could be described as similar to sparkling wine, with medium sweetness and a distinct honey-based flavor. Mead could be made with various flavors and alcohol content. Monasteries, which were involved with substantial beekeeping operations to make candle wax, produced large amounts of honey, which they made into mead. Monks were a major brewer of mead in medieval England. After the Black Death plague of the mid-14th century, production of honey decreased, possibly due to the Little Ice Age and its effects on climate in Northern Europe. Prices rose for mead, while people that used to drink this beverage switched their preferences to ale and beer. As the medieval period neared its close, the popularity of mead had decreased substantially. During medieval times, socializing, business affairs, gambling with cards, dice, and games of leisure would often accompany the consumption of alcoholic beverages at alehouses and taverns. For the nobility, they would enjoy drinking pleasures at banquets within their manors or estates. However, for most commoners frequenting these drinking establishments, they encountered an environment of mixed reputation. Medieval people typically consumed beverages with a lower alcohol content. Nevertheless, one could not help but assume with the large quantities they drank that many would experience some degree of impairment. As a result, rowdy behavior, increased accidents, brawling, and assaults were common occurrences at these drinking establishments. Today, people enjoy alcoholic drinks during various pleasurable activities and relaxing moments, though our consumption of alcohol in modern times is not nearly to the regularity and quantity of the medieval period. In addition, the social norms of alcohol consumption have changed from being an important part of everyday life in the Middle Ages to one of moderation and awareness. Similar to modern society, sports were a popular pastime for people living in medieval England. Even more surprising is that some of the most enjoyed sports of today were also popular during the Middle Ages. However, many viewers will be shocked to learn that these 4 favorite sporting activities we enjoy today were actually banned in medieval England. These banned activities included football, called soccer in North America. Why? In this episode, we will present 4 banned medieval sports which are still popular today, and the weird reasons why they were outlawed. Medieval football was banned over 30 times. When we think of modern football today, it is a high-profile sport which combines great skill, grace, and wonder. Often called the beautiful game, it is the most popular sport in the world today, including modern England. Though during medieval times in England, football was not played on manicured pitches or inside giant stadiums. The Middle Ages version of a playing field was a whole town or village. Therefore, goal lines could be miles apart from each other. The ball, usually an inflated bladder from an animal like a pig, was not limited to play by one's feet. There were very few rules in medieval football, so you could run with the ball in your hands while opponents could kick and assault a runner to get that ball. In fact, fouls for roughness and violence were rarely if ever called. Stabbings and even murder occurred during these matches, which could last for days before one team got the ball past their opponent's goal line. Speaking of teams, there is no limit to the size of a team, with these games usually contested between different villages or towns. This predecessor of modern football has been named folk football or mob football. Then came a law which would be unthinkable to football fans today. King Edward II banned this sport in 1314 AD in London because he felt it was a public nuisance. Punishment was 6 days imprisonment in a dingy medieval cell for violating the ban. In 1349 AD, English King Edward III also banned this sport for similar reasons. Folk football was banned nationally in 1388 AD because it took men away from the practice of archery. King Edward IV also banned this sport in 1477 AD. Some researchers estimate there were over 30 bans on folk football in a period of 350 years, beginning with the first in 1314 AD. So, how could this happen in, of all places, England? Here is a case of where country had to come before sport. In medieval England, various monarchs viewed folk football as a national security issue which took manpower away from preparation for their numerous battles. In the case of Edward III, after the devastations to its population from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, followed by the Black Death reaching England in 1348 AD, there was a serious problem for raising armies. These catastrophes led to a shortage of able-bodied men to serve as soldiers. Meanwhile, folk football caused injuries and harm to the very soldiers needed for armies, so men were banned from playing football by the monarch. This was just one example of various bans on folk football over many decades. However, by the year 1845, these older laws had been repealed. Folk football has evolved over hundreds of years into modern football, with rules and football pitches. In modern times, the violent play of folk football has disappeared, with a rough tackle today not resulting in an opponent's death. Medieval tennis is corrupting peasants. Modern tennis is a popular sport enjoyed by millions around the world. The ancestor of modern tennis originated in France during the 13th century. Monks played a game in their courtyards at medieval monasteries called jeu de paume, though instead of rackets, it was played with your bare hands or leather gloves. The ball was made from leather or cork. This game arrived in medieval England during the 14th century, where it became popular among both the working and upper classes. In the Middle Ages, nobility viewed real tennis as a bad influence on masses of peasants, feeling it disrupted their work ethic and production for feudal masters. The nobility also implied that vices like gambling formed a destructive part of entertainment when lower classes played real tennis. In reality, the nobility wished to exclude the lower classes from a sport they wished to establish as a pleasure strictly for the upper classes. Slowly, the upper classes transformed the game with costly equipment, a code of etiquette, and strict rules of play to make real tennis into a sport for the wealthy. They built elaborate standardized courts at their manors and palaces, with scoring similar to modern lawn tennis, though the design of courts and rules differ today from medieval England's real tennis. To ensure real tennis became a game for the wealthy only with no peasant involvement, monarchs introduced bans. Edward III banned this early form of modern tennis in 1365 AD. Other edicts against this early form of tennis included Henry IV proclaiming that all laborers and servants were to stop playing this game. In 1477, Edward IV accused tennis of causing crime, poverty, and even murder in the lower classes. Therefore, in the year 1485 AD, it was deemed illegal for anyone but the nobility to play tennis, with Christmas Day being the only time commoners could play the sport. Now you know why one popular title for tennis is the Sport of Kings, with monarchs like Henry VII and Henry VIII being passionate players. Today, the sport of tennis is played or watched by millions of people all over the world. Those are my fish only. For centuries, people have fished lakes, streams, rivers, and oceans, though in medieval England, it was an activity that could place you in serious trouble with the law, depending on what you caught. Since 1322 AD, if you catch what are considered royal fish anywhere in the realm, you are technically stealing property from the monarch. Royal fish include sturgeons, dolphins, and whales. Even if they wash ashore, according to this law, they should be offered at first to the monarch. Of course, this rarely occurs in everyday practice. By the way, it is still illegal today to catch royal fish. Interestingly, the punishment for breaking this law is unknown. Stay away from bowling lanes, you peasant. The origin of bowling goes back many centuries. It is such an old sport that scenes picturing an early form of bowling were discovered on wall drawings inside a royal Egyptian tomb from 3200 BC. The balls were made from grain husks stuffed into a casing like leather and held together with a string. So, why would such a harmless game be banned in medieval England? Leave that answer to English monarch Edward III. In 1366 AD, he banned bowling because it was so popular among soldiers that it interfered with their archery practice. For those that broke this law, you were lucky to escape with a statutory fine of 6 shillings 8 pence. Of course, the rules for nobility were different. If they possessed property worth more than £100, a license could be obtained which allowed you the privilege of bowling. Bowling enthusiast and English monarch Henry VIII banned the peasant classes from bowling altogether in 1511 AD. After centuries of being law, this ban was later revised. Similar to modern times, sports were an important part of medieval life. It is also surprising to note some of today's most preferred sports were also popular in the Middle Ages, though with rules in place suited to the social norms of their day. However, the harsh realities of medieval society meant pleasure for everyone was second to battles, preparedness for disasters, and maintaining class distinctions. The year is 1303. You wake up to a day that seems like any other in a hard life. Today, you have grain which needs to be ground into flour. When you arrive at the miller, they ask if you are paying in gold coins. When you laugh, they look back at you with a serious stare. Later that day, you hear about school children finding gems in an open field. You listen as people say valuable items are showing up everywhere in London, like a shower of wealth from above. At this point, you realize this cannot be true. That is, until weeks later you find out it was all too real. When you find out to your shock that this year's national tax income was stolen, 2 thoughts enter your mind. First, with the country fighting a long, bitter war against the Scots, who will pay for it? Then, since you live in 1303 England, you know King Edward I is about to send the taxman to your door. Hello everyone, my name is Craig, host of Medieval to Modern, where we feature fascinating information from civilization's medieval ages. Thank you for joining us today. In the year 1303, King Edward I was based in York, occupied with a bloody war against the Scots and William Wallace. The last thing occupying his mind were administrative affairs. However, when strong word reached his ears about extravagant spending in London, his attention quickly changed. Word was spreading fast about London brothel owners receiving payment in gold florins. Silver plates and tableware embossed with the royal seal were caught by fishermen on the River Thames. Merchants were being compensated for their wares with valuable objects and more rare coinage. To his stunned ears, it seemed the streets of London were awash with instant wealth, though it took him only a moment to realize what had happened. These riches could only be from one source. When it was confirmed that his treasury had suffered from a large theft, he immediately set off with extreme anger back to London. As he left York, the severity of this new crisis hit him hard. The remainder of his treasury was held in Westminster Abbey. It was there, under locks and keys, that royal treasury which did not accompany him was kept safe and secure. These items included crown jewels, silver cups, gold florins, and other valuable royal family possessions. King Edward I had complete trust in the Benedictine monks at Westminster Abbey, where these priceless treasures were kept hidden in the Pyx chamber. To his mind, they were devoted, loyal, and a constant presence to keep watch over this great fortune. Finished with 13-foot thick walls, this chamber was thought to be the safest vault at the time in England. At this time, King Edward I was already fighting a costly military campaign which drained his kingdom's coffers. He knew this was fact because the majority of his royal treasury accompanied him under armed guard. He could not afford any unexpected financial losses. Now, the king knew his financial situation was becoming a major threat to the kingdom. Nevertheless, as ruler, he viewed this war as crucial to the future success of England. He already pursued an aggressive tax policy to finance this campaign and was committed to do more for victory against the Scots. Wars are costly affairs, and the king constantly required fresh funds to pay for it. However, one of the targets of his heavy tax policy was the church, and they were already stretched to the financial limit, though the latest demand from the monarch, a shockingly steep increase for tribute, would be very hard to meet. King Edward I, who was nicknamed Edward Longshanks, could not stop grasping for every coin his subjects owned. Among the king's subjects was a man who gave all of his money and some of his time to the king. Richard of Pudlicott was a former wool merchant from Oxfordshire. In his past, he had been imprisoned in Flanders as guarantor for some of Edward I's debts. On top of this punishment, they forced him to pay 14 pounds of the royal debt, a handsome sum in today's currency. When he attempted to receive compensation from the king for his loss, he was denied. Now, broke and desperate for funds to pay off debts, he needed money fast. During his claim for compensation, Richard of Pudlicott had visited Westminster Abbey. While in the vicinity of the abbey, he heard growing dissatisfaction with the king's taxes and unpaid debts. He decided to use the growing anger to his advantage, setting up as a merchant nearby. With his charm and good talk, he formed a bond with two important people at the abbey, John Shench and William of the Palace. Since he was known as a regular merchant, he often walked the abbey grounds unsupervised. Then, after gaining increasing trust, one of the monks at the abbey talked about its secret treasury with him. It was during this time he also witnessed the great wealth contained at the abbey, vowing to take it all for himself. The desperate Richard of Pudlicott then began devising his plan for theft and revenge on the king. When King Edward I arrived in London, he met his worst nightmare. The royal treasury at Westminster Abbey was estimated to be worth £100,000. This was an extraordinary amount, equaling 1 year's tax revenue for his kingdom. Unfortunately for the king, it was gone. After a period of time had lapsed, on June 6, 1303, the monarch commenced an investigation. It would last many months. In his rage, he cast a wide net for conspirators, including the known frequent visitor of the abbey, Richard of Pudlicott. He was arrested on June 25th, along with William of the Palace. During this investigation, 48 monks and 32 servants were also sent to the Tower of London. By the time this trial began, only 10 monks and Richard of Pudlicott were facing charges. The rest of the monks and others had been freed. At the trial, all were eager to hear how this huge theft was carried out. Sworn testimony from witnesses provided one version of events. Witnesses that were in the vicinity of Westminster Abbey at the time gave the following testimony. They said the accused and a large number of accomplices took the treasure outside from the center of the abbey. Skilled craftsmen were also brought in, since it was difficult to access the crypt. Adding to the difficulty, the crypt had a trap within, which only a person or persons that had been inside could know about. The sheer size of items taken needed lay people and clergy alike to carry out the deed without opposition, which meant this was either a grand conspiracy or one of the greatest instances of negligence ever imaginable. However, Richard of Pudlicott had his own version of events, which was even more shocking. He decided on a martyr's defense, claiming to have acted completely alone without the aid of any other person. As for gaining information on the treasure and access, that too, he said, came from his planned visits to the abbey. He confessed to taking over 90 days during the winter months to dig alone underneath the grounds of Westminster Abbey. He finished this massive task in the days following Easter. Richard of Pudlicott claimed a prior small-scale robbery of silverware at the abbey gave him knowledge on how to proceed with this much larger theft. Once inside the crypt on April the 24th, he said it took him a day to ponder which valuables to rob. With so much to carry, he then claimed to have hidden on abbey grounds what he could not take away first, retrieving those goods the following evening. By the morning of April the 26th, the deed was done. Once again, he said this was all conducted by himself. Who was the trial to believe? Well, Richard of Pudlicott would be punished. He was eventually found guilty of the crime. On November the 28th, 1305, he was taken from imprisonment in the Tower of London and hung in Tothill Lane on the abbot's gallows, then flayed. Despite his testimony, it was too much for the trial to believe he acted alone. William of the Palace was hung back in March of 1304, along with 5 lay people. Contrary to a popular myth, the skin of Richard of Pudlicott was not nailed to the door of Westminster Abbey. In a 2005 study, it was determined that fragments found on the remaining iron door strap were from an animal skin, which at one time covered the door. In the months following this massive theft, the royal treasury was relocated to the Tower of London, while Westminster Abbey had its crypt made more secure. Then the treasury returned to the abbey. It is curious to note King Edward I continued to use Westminster Abbey and the crypt location to store his royal treasury. Eventually, King Edward I recovered most of the stolen royal treasury. Silverware and other items embossed with the royal seal were easily identified. Foreign gold coins were also easy to locate, as were royal gemstones. We should mention that not all of the royal treasury was recovered. The coronet of the last sovereign Prince of Wales, seized by King Edward I in 1284, was never found after 1303. It was kept at Westminster Abbey until the time of the Great Royal Heist. The coronet coronet was not present during an inventory undertaken by Oliver Cromwell in 1649. Currently, it is on a list of missing treasures. Richard of Pudlicott was not the only person to suffer the king's refusal to honor his debts. In fact, King Edward I refused to pay numerous other debts. When this king passed away in 1307, he still owed a massive sum, estimated at £200,000. The majority of this debt was still owed 20 years later when his son's rule came to an end. The greatest royal heist in history amounted to 1 year's worth of tax receipts from the royal treasury. For comparison purposes, the British government took in revenue of over £718 billion in the year 2021. Even the most conservative estimates put the 1303 haul at over £30 billion today. If you believe Richard of Pudlicott's confession that he had acted alone, no one person has ever stolen this amount of money equivalent at one time. Even with accomplices, this figure will be extremely difficult to steal at one time. Which brings us to that time at which we will share the Medieval to Modern top 8 of intriguing facts about the great royal heist of Richard of Pudlicott. As our viewers know, we believe knowledge is ageless as well as enjoyable. Now, we shall present them all for your learning pleasure. Number 1. Richard of Pudlicott still possessed £2,000 of stolen property at the time of his arrest, a vast sum at the time. Number 2. The Westminster Abbey door, examined for human skin in 2005, is the oldest known door in England. Number 3. Surprisingly, Richard of Pudlicott did serve time as a clerk in his past, though he left the clergy. Number 4. At this time in English history, the Treasury was referred to as the King's Wardrobe, an official office of government dealing with financial matters. The term came from the clothes closet of the king. Number 5. The Pyx Chamber at Westminster Abbey has existed since 1070. Number 6. If the tax revenue of the United States government for 2021 were taken, it would amount to over $4 trillion. Number 7. The trial for Richard of Pudlicott was one of the largest in England during the High Medieval period, which was between 1000 AD and the 1300s AD. Number 8. Even the Abbot of Westminster, or head of the Abbey, was arrested for this theft, but was later released. Thank you for supporting us at Medieval to Modern. Please be sure to watch our next episode, or one shown at the end of this video. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and spread the word about this channel so we can create more exciting content. I wish you good tidings as we remember that sharing knowledge has been a noble deed throughout the ages.